SpongeBob meme would say, 30 years later. So we're back in the book of Numbers, but we are moving along time-wise. So this is actually at the end of that 40-year period. This is shortly before the wilderness wanderings end, and they're about to go in the promised land. They're at the border of that, and starts off by saying Miriam died. Remember, everyone from that first generation, except Joshua and Caleb, are going to die before they enter the promised land. They're not allowed in. That includes Miriam. So she is likely one of the last people from that first generation, and she dies. And it just mentions that almost in passing, moving on to rebellion. As we've been talking about, this is what happens. This is the theme. They're just going to rebel again. And we actually get something that's very much like what we saw back in Exodus. One of the first issues they had when they left after the Red Sea, they got out of Egypt, and then they complained about water. We go look back in Exodus, go look at chapters 16 and 17. They had several grumblings, several complaints and rebellions, and this was one of them. And they had a very similar issue. They said, we don't have any water, and then God told Moses to strike the rock, and water came out. Now, that was what happened the first time. This time's a little different. It reads very much the same, except there's a key difference. God does not say to strike the rock this time. He says, speak to it. Now, first of all, we see that here the next generation isn't starting out so great, right? They're having the same issue as their parents. This is, you could call this an inclusio. It's like bookends. So as they're going into the wilderness, they have this issue. They have a complaint of water, and this is how God solves it. And as they're about to come out of the wilderness, the same thing. So you're having these things on opposite ends of the wilderness journey. But here, God says, speak to the rock. And actually, when he says that, if we look in chapter 20, look at verse 7. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. And when he says, and tell, he's talking to both Moses and Aaron, actually. In the Hebrew, you can tell that it's a plural. So we don't do it the exact same way in English, but there's saying it to one person as an individual and saying to multiple people. And this one is to the multiple people. So he's telling both Moses and Aaron to do this, which is key because both of them get punished when what happens instead? They strike the rock. Moses strikes the rock again, just like he did last time, except he wasn't supposed to this time. And so when that happens, God says, okay, you two, you're not going to be able to enter the promised land either. You're going to die in the desert just like this first generation. So this time it's Moses and Aaron again. Aaron's been rebellious before. He's doing this again, and Moses is being rebellious this time as well. Now, that's why it's important to notice that God is speaking to both of them when he says, tell the rock, speak to the rock, and say this, because Aaron also did not speak to the rock. He may have been a little more passive as far as his actions. He didn't actually hit the rock, but he didn't speak to it either like he was supposed to. Now, why is it, though, that he needed to speak to it this time? Well, what happened last time? The rock was struck. Why was that? What was the point? What was the message here? I'll link below when we talked about this back in Exodus, when this happened, and we talked about how the rock was pointing to Jesus. And when Jesus was struck, that produced water for the life of his people. Here, he doesn't need to be struck again. If this rock is representing Jesus, he doesn't get struck a second time. Jesus didn't have to get crucified 2 times. He died once for the sins of all, and that was enough. You don't keep re-crucifying Jesus. Striking him a second time, not okay, because now it's just speaking to the rock. And so here, instead, he did strike the rock a second time. He's not conveying the message he should be conveying. He's conveying something different. So Moses and Aaron are then punished. they're not going to see the promised land. They can maybe see it, but they're not going to be able to go into it with the second generation. Now, the next thing we can see is how Israel had to deal with a number of other nations. So first, they meet up with Edom. They want to go through Edom and just travel by, not bother them, just go along the highway. Like, hey guys, we're just going to go down the interstate. We're not going to take any exits. We're just going to go straight through. And Edom's like, no. You also have, later on in the next chapter, Arad. It says, chapter 21, verse 1, when the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by the way of Atharim, he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. So he just goes and straight attacks them. Edom threatens to, but Israel says, nope, we're not going to fight, goes around. This guy just goes and attacks them. And then later on, we'll see Sihon, king of the Amorites. So that's chapter 21, verse 21. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, and they tried to do the same thing as with Edom. Hey, we just want to pass through. We're not trying to bother you. And then that guy comes and he attacks them. And you also have King Og. And so that's at the end of chapter 21. Verse 34, when you have Og, king of Bashan, and it says, but Yahweh said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have given him into your hand, and all his people, and his land. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. Which, what he did is, they defeated him. So they end up actually getting extra land from this, essentially, because with some of these kings that attacked them, they end up defeating them and being able to take their land. Now, it's important to notice, though, here, how Israel is conducting warfare in these cases. So with Edom, straight up just like backing off before Edom even gets all the way over there to have that battle. They retreat. Edom has been given that land by God, and Israel's supposed to avoid the conflict. And Edom is actually the brother nation, because Israel, the person Israel, his name was Jacob, became Israel. His brother was Esau, and that's where the Edomites come from. So they are actually, their nations both started from brothers. And God has given that land to the Edomites. Israel's not supposed to take it. They are trying to avoid battle there. Now, with these other nations, they're not initially given all of that land, particularly on the east side of the river, the Jordan River. They're not given that land initially. That's not part of what was promised to them. But these guys come and make a fight out of it. Israel is not starting the fight in this case. Israel's going to go over to the other side of the river, the land that God had promised them, the land that needs to be judged, and God is sending them to judge it, and they're going to start some fights there. And that's a separate situation from elsewhere. Here, they're not trying to start a fight. They're not trying to go attack these people. These people preemptively attack them, and they get wiped out. And so Israel now has this land. And later on, we'll see Moab and Ammon. They're also concerned about Israel coming through. Now, Moab and Ammon, they are brother nations that come from Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham. So you have kind of this genealogy. You have Abraham, and then there's a split. There's Abraham's nephew, and he has a couple kids that end up having these nations, Ammon and Moab, and then he got Isaac, and Isaac actually has a brother, Ishmael, who has the Midianites, and then but Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and so then you get Israel and Edom. And so you have all these nations around here that are kind of related in ways. Not every nation is. The Canaanites are not part of that, but you have a number of nations that are. And so they're not trying to just take over all the land willy-nilly, and they're not allowed to do that. They're actually, in this case, they're defending themselves and end up, because the other nations attack them, the other nations get judged. And we've seen back in Genesis, God says, those who bless Abraham and his descendants will be blessed, and those who curse them will be cursed. And we see by extension here, those that attack them, they're going to get destroyed. That's what happens in several different sections in these two chapters. But that's not all that happens. We have a couple other things that happen in chapters 20 and 21 that we're looking at today. And one of those is the death of Aaron. Aaron died. So Miriam's died, That's the oldest sister. So you have Miriam, and then you had Aaron, and then you had Moses. They're siblings. Miriam's the oldest, then Aaron, and then Moses. And Aaron, his death, there's more to it, and this is partially at least because he's the high priest. What's going to happen here? Well, he's the high priest, and they take his son, Eleazer, and then Moses transfers the authority of the high priesthood to Eleazer, takes off the priestly garments, the priestly clothes, and puts them on his son. So transferring that position over because the high priest is going to die. They have to keep having new high priests. This is going to be a problem because the high priest can't intercede forever because he's going to die. This is part of what makes Jesus the greatest high priest, because he's not going to die, because he is always there, always lives to intercede on our behalf. Unlike Aaron, who cannot continue to intercede for his people because he's going to die. And so this is where he dies. He dies up on this mountain, and Eleazar becomes the new priest, the new high priest. So he was a priest before, and now he has got this position of high priest as the oldest living son of Aaron. And so that's what we see here with Aaron, with him having to pass down his authority to his son, and they leave him up on the mountain. He dies, and then move on. So now Moses is kind of by himself there. He's got this first generation all being wiped out over the past 40 years, culminating with Miriam and Aaron, and eventually him. We're not there yet, but that's coming as well. But before that happens, more rebellion. Why not? This next generation, not off to a great start. Bronze serpent. You may have heard of this narrative. Well, what happens is they're complaining again. And it's actually a similar complaint to what we've heard earlier. Let's look at it. 21, verse 5. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So there's no food, but actually there is food. We just don't like it. We're just going to be picky. Then Yahweh sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. So these people now have another problem. They're being plagued by snakes, which is interesting because snakes were significant in Egypt. There was supposedly, according to their lore, the Egyptians had these snakes that would protect them. This is part of their idea of their different gods and stuff, and they thought snakes were part of this, and in their stories, the snakes protected the pharaohs and things like that. The pharaoh had this thing on his head that was called a uraeus that has these two snakes on there as well. So there's symbolism here that the snakes are attacking them. And they've just said, we wish we were in Egypt. We wish we had all this kind of stuff that they had in Egypt. It's like, you want me to remind you about Egypt, how great Egypt was? Sent some snakes on them. Now, here, they were dying. So this was a type of kind of a plague. They're being plagued, kind of like Egypt was back in Exodus, because they're wanting to return to Egypt. You want to be like the Egyptians? Okay, remember what happened to them? Now, he doesn't leave them there, though, because God is so merciful. So he could just say, all right, well, you're on your own now. You guys want to complain about this. But he doesn't. What he does is he tells Moses, make a bronze or a copper serpent and put it up on a pole, stick it up there. Everyone can see it. When someone gets bitten, they're going to die. But if they look up at that snake, they will not die. They'll be healed. Now, this may seem a bit odd, like many things in the law books. Why is that? What's the purpose? Well, actually, we see that. You go flip over to not John 3:16, one of the probably most famous verses in the Bible, but John 3:14, 2 verses before that leads right up to that. So, we'll look in John chapter 3. Starting in verse 12. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. He says, "If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." So this represents Jesus, this serpent being on this pole, Jesus being on the cross, looking at the serpent. You are healed. Believing in Jesus, you are healed. There's a parallel there. This is called typology. This is pointing us to Jesus, as so often happens in the Old Testament. It's pointing us forward to what will be. And that's the purpose of what's going on here. Just a couple other things to note before we wrap up. When we look at the snakes, the fiery snakes, what does it mean? Is it perhaps that they're fiery as in it's a very stinging bite, like it's a very painful bite that happens? Or perhaps this is supposed to be referencing back to these snakes that in the stories protected the Egyptian pharaohs that would shoot fire out. So maybe not literally shooting fire out, but perhaps calling it that to remind them of that connection there. Also, this word, sometimes when it says fiery serpents, it's using the Hebrew word seraph, because a seraph just means a fiery one. So when we see later on in the Bible, it talks about seraphim and cherubim. The I am is that's just the plural for whatever word, and so it's the seraphs and the cherubs. So these types of angelic beings, one of them is called just the fiery ones. So that's kind of interesting to see that word used that way. But lastly, let's just make sure we take this narrative and we take it and we tuck it away, and we're going to come back to it later. Because in Deuteronomy 5, we are going to take it back out and look at it again. Because when we get to the Ten Commandments and we talk about them, those first ones, this is going to have some bearing on how we understand those to be communicated to us. What is the commandment saying? What is it not saying? This will have something to say about that. So let's just don't forget about this narrative as we move on. We'll be back to it soon when we get to Deuteronomy. Until then, we're going to move on to this bit of prophecy. The next several chapters are going to have a lot of prophecy as we have the narrative of Balak and Bilaam, or as a lot of people call them, Balaam. And we're going to see what happens with them in the next section. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.